Our reading jumps ahead a little bit from where we last left off. We were with Jacob, who's Israel. And now it's Israel's turn to take sort of a back seat in the narrative. And we have Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. He's at the beginning of a very, very bad time in our Old Testament reading today. Through a strange series of events, most of which aren't Joseph's fault, his brothers hate him and want to kill him. The text makes it clear Joseph is the father's favorite child. His father is Jacob, who became Israel, and Joseph is gifted with these dreams and interpreting dreams. So at one point, he tells his brothers, I had this dream where you all were bowing down before me. Isn't that weird, guys? And his brothers began to be upset with him. Rightfully so, because, again, why would the youngest child think that just because he was the favorite, he deserves everything in the world? But none of this is anything that Joseph has asked for. He's simply living his life, playing the hand of cards that was dealt before him. Israel gives his favored son the long-sleeved coat. And had to be an expensive gift because we often recall and say that this coat had many fantastic and wonderful colors on it. Dyeing things was quite expensive. Regardless, whatever it looked like, however long the sleeves were, the coat in and of itself was expensive. No one else got a coat like that. But Joseph, the youngest child, gets the snazzy, expensive new coat. He never asked for it. He never asked to be the favorite. He never asked for a gift of prophecy via dreams. None of this was something that he wanted. But because of all of this, because of his life and how it has played out before him, he now finds himself in the predicament where his brothers hate and despise him. Older brothers being older brothers, well, they want to deal with it. Only they don't want to deal with it in the sense of like noogies or wedgies or things like that. No, they want to completely get rid of this man. And so they make a plot to kill him. His father sends Joseph to his brothers, and they hatch this plan. When they see him off in the distance, they're like, there's that little so-and-so. We should kill him. Reuben tries to stop the madness and tell him, just throw him in the pit. Because he wants to come back later and save him, which is a smart move, not only because murder is ostensibly wrong, but also because, Reuben can go to his dad and say, hey, I saved your favorite child. They don't kill him, they put him in a pit. They put him in a pit with no water, and they're just kind of sitting there waiting. And as they're waiting, they see Ishmaelites. And it's interesting that they're labeled as Ishmaelites because it calls back a lot. It's such a throwback because we know that they come from Ishmael, which was the other son of Abraham. And so they see these people, and they say, hey, we could kill two birds, metaphorically, because we're not murdering anybody, but we could kill two birds with one stone. We could get rid of Joseph and make money. So they decide to sell him into slavery. Can't help but feel a little bad for Reuben in this situation, because by all accounts, he wanted to save Joseph, and now he can't. His plan to save Joseph is now officially ruined. He can't do it if he's sold into slavery. He could have stood his ground against his brothers and not buckled to the pressure, but I get it. Humans have a tendency to want to save their own skin. And Reuben is, no exception. But for Joseph, for the people of the tribe of Israel, this sets in motion a massive series of events that are going to come to define the people. See, the reason that Joseph gets to go to Egypt is because of this. But while he is there, this is all a part of God's plan, because we have the story of how he gets sold to Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife, who's never named, and she makes a pass at him, and he winds up in jail, of all places. And he winds up in jail with someone who's having these weird dreams, and he tells him what the dream is. And so when he gets out, the king starts having weird dreams. He's like, hey, I know a guy. And so, of course, then they get Joseph out of prison. They take him to him. He does the dreams, and we know it's about the famine, and Egypt is able to prosper because of the famine. It's beautiful. It's beautiful and it's horrible in the same way, because, again, none of this was Joseph's fault. He didn't want any of this. He just wanted to live his life. It would be hard for us to imagine, I wagered, what would be going through Joseph's mind in the midst of all of this. Waiting in a pit, being sold into slavery, everything that happens. Most of us likely have never been betrayed by such a way, especially by family being sold into slavery. I mean, I got blamed for things that my sister did, and Lord knows I threw her under the bus every chance I got. But never once did I want to actually physically harm and kill her, or leave her in a pit, or sell her into slavery. I think it's easy to say at times we've been hurt by people. It's something that we have gone through. It's devastating and it's painful, and oftentimes these situations happen and we're left thinking what Joseph was thinking. Where is God in the midst of all of this? Theodicy is the vindication of divine goodness and providence in the view of the existence of evil. And that's a fancy way of saying, why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God permit evil to happen? Is this not a good God that we worship? Why do people suffer? And to be clear here, there's not an easy answer. Lord knows I wish that there was, but there's not some nice, neat little Hallmark greeting card that's going to make us feel better for everything that we have to go through. The answer simply is that evil exists in this world, and that evil causes suffering. And the only solace and hope that we have in the midst of all of this is that we have God. Our one hope, the one thing that keeps us going in the midst of the chaos and the pain and the hurt, is that God is still rules. That's it. That's the constant. That's the one thing that we can hold on to. There's literally no peace in the midst of chaos outside the stabilizing force of Jesus Christ. Paul talks about it as the peace that passes all understanding, but really what it is, it's like you go through an event and your entire world gets dumped upside down. And so worlds, as we know, through Earth, it spins on a specific axis, right? And if that axis were to shift and tilt, it would be catastrophic. There would be a lot of horrible things that happen very quickly. What Jesus does in the midst of everything is to come and fix that access point. Jesus comes and saves us, allows us to set the world right in motion when the world gets turned upside down. And we see this in the gospel reading today. We see Jesus as the thing that can fix the world, that can save the people and do all things for the people. Jesus tells the disciples to go and get on a boat after he's done talking to people. He takes his time, he talks with people, he heals people, and he tells them to go on out. He's going to go up on the mountain to pray, which is a very important thing to do. After all, he just spent a lot of time working, so naturally he would want to unwind, and how he chooses to unwind is sitting in the presence of God Almighty. He wants to do the pastoral thing and dismiss the crowds of people, so he's shaking hands and telling people, have a blessed week, standard post-sermon stuff. And as he goes off to pray and the disciples go off on the boat, a terrible storm happens. There's so much wind, and the boat is rocking, and in the morning, they're trying to get back to land, and because of how the weather is, they just can't do it. The wind is against them. They don't have motors, and they don't have, half a dozen slaves or so to, row the boat ashore or anything like that. And so they're kind of stuck. I've been stuck on a boat before. It was actually kind of fun. I was in, I think, 8th grade. We were on a field trip to Put in Bay, and for some reason, we just kept doing laps in Lake Erie because we couldn't dock or something. And it was one of the weirdest experiences I've ever had in my life. And by the end of it, I was like, I'm done. I would like to get off this boat. It didn't matter that, I was rocking and having fun with friends. It was I'm bored of this and I need to get off of this. The disciples, however, don't have the luxury that I had. And so in the midst of all of this, they're doing what people would normally do. They're panicking, they're worrying, and they look off and they see Jesus. They don't see land. And that's one of the bad things. When you're so far out in a lake, or you're so far out in the ocean or a sea, and you look around and you can't see land, that's one of the most disorienting things that you can possibly imagine. And instead of seeing the land, what they see instead is Jesus. And he's walking on water. And I've never been great at, math. I'm okay at science. But what I do know is that things with mass tend to sink in water. And yet Jesus is walking on the water. Basic science will tell you that this is not possible. The surface tension of water does not support the weight of a fully grown man. Peter decides to test all of this. And so he calls out to Jesus. He says, Jesus, if it's you, call me to you. He's like, I'm pretty sure it's you. You look like Jesus. This certainly is something that Jesus would do, but I need to be sure. And I get it. He needs to be sure because nothing is making sense. I mean, see a guy walking on water. There's a storm that's kind of still going on. Massive waves dealing with. They're stuck. They're not able to move. And so Peter just needs some blessed assurance at this point. And he asks him, he's like, Jesus, if it's you, call me to you. And this is after Jesus said, guys, don't panic, it's me. He says, if it's really you, call me to you, and I'll come to you. Because if you call me to you, then that means I can do the thing that you're doing, and then we'll all know that it's you, and then we'll be able to calm down. Because in the midst of terror, in the midst of fear, that's what we want. We want to make sure, and we want to know that Jesus is there. That Jesus is there for us. And so, that's what happens. He calls to Peter and he says, come. And he does. And the crazy thing is that as he gets off the boat, he starts walking on water. I like to imagine this scene. One of my favorite cartoons, the old Looney Tunes, outside of Foghorn Leghorn, who I think was probably my favorite Looney Tune, I always had a soft spot for the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. Mostly because that show defied physics. Those shorts always defied physics, right? Wile E. Coyote would be running and he'd run right off a cliff and he'd just be standing there. And then he would look down and he would say, oh, I'm not standing on anything. This isn't possible. And then he would fall. This is kind of what happens here. Peter is walking along and he sees a wind and he gets afraid because he's like, oh yeah, I'm walking on water. That's not normal. And so Peter does this thing where he starts to sink. Maybe he has the little Wile E. Coyote sign that says help and he holds it up. And we're not exactly sure, but what we do know is that he starts falling and Jesus is there. Jesus is there and he grabs his hand and lifts him up and chastises him for having not enough faith, having just a little bit of faith. And it's kind of, a little bit of a what for Peter because he was doing it. He was doing the impossible. In the midst of all of the fear, all of the terror, everything going wrong, his own version of a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. In the midst of all of that, Jesus is there with him and Peter is doing the impossible. It's crazy to me. And if we think about it, we do impossible things each and every day. We are, after all, a tiny lump of gray matter, our brains, piloting a skeleton and muscle suit. But when it comes to our current state, when it comes to suffering and pain, we think we can't get through it. We think that there are things that we can't do because it's too much, it's too hard, it's too difficult, it's too this, it's too that. And yet consistently, what we do is we survive. 100% of the things that you have claimed were the worst days of your life, you got through them. And you got through them because of God. We think that way because, like Peter, we take our eyes off Jesus. Like, he was fine walking. He was able to do it, but yet he goes and he sees Jesus and he looks away. He sees what's actually going on around him. And what happens then is nothing good. All because he stopped focusing on Jesus, the center, the thing that could fix everything. The whole story about Joseph is not about the code, it's not about the dreams even, but it sets the stage for one of the most historic moments of the Israelite people, the Exodus from Egypt, because that's where the story ends. One of the very first things we read when we get to Exodus is a Pharaoh came along who did not remember Joseph. Because by the end of Genesis, and this is the last little bit, like the Genesis story ends with Joseph, and then we get into Exodus. And by the end of that story, everything's fine. Joseph is alive. His brothers are alive. His dad is alive. Everybody is eating through the midst of the famine because Joseph did a good thing, because through everything that he went through, he was doing what God wanted him to do. He didn't waver. He didn't falter. He just did what it was that God had called him to do. We assume, wrongly so, that things need to be okay here and now, that everything needs to be fine. And I get it, because we as human beings, we like comfort, we like peace, we like stability, and anything that goes against that is going to be frustrating and problematic. But that's not the way that the world works. And so when things get rocky, when the waves start coming, we lose sight of Jesus and we start to sink. And we start to sink because we're not thinking long-term anymore at that point. Our faith, our patient endurance is what helps us get through the trials and the pitfalls of our lives. And that's it. That's it. That's the only thing that we can do. In the midst of things not being okay, we have to hold on to the truth. We have to hold on that in the midst of chaos and change, that Jesus Christ is still there, standing, doing the impossible, reaching a hand out to us so that we might be with him. To do this sets us up for failure because it's hard. It's so hard. It's hard to be an optimist in a world of pessimism. It's hard when you see and feel that the world is crashing down around you. All of it is so very hard. It's problematic. It's troubling. It's all of these things. And yet, we have our faith. We have our trust in Jesus. And that is the one thing that we hold on to, that in the midst of a crazy and mixed up world, whatever comes our way, whatever happens, whatever curveballs life throws at us, this, that, or the other thing, that Jesus Christ is there to fix and solve all things because he loves us. Amen.